There's a comforting map in our heads when we think of Normandy: green pastures stitched by hedgerows, the slow cut of the Seine, stone churches with crooked bell towers, and the tidy rows of World War II cemeteries where dates and names sit like settled dust. You expect order here, a tidy chain of cause and effect, ancient farmers, then Romans, then Vikings, then dukes and kings. But step off the beaten lanes into the fog that clings to the fields in the early morning and something else arrives, a silence that feels older than any of those histories, a set of mounds and hollows whose shapes refuse to fit the tidy story you know. That clash, the ordinary world we recognize and the stubborn, inexplicable traces beneath our feet, is where this story begins. I want to take you there, not merely to catalog curiosities but to hold them in your hands, to feel the weight of a bone or the cold iron of a ring and listen to what modern science says, what local lore insists, and what neither can fully explain. We promise big revelations, strange objects, contested dates, and theories that range from the scholarly to the sensational. Giants collapsed beneath cairns, lost voyagers from across the sea, stone markers that hum at night. Above all, we promise questions, stubborn questions that keep archaeologists awake, and keep the villagers speaking in low voices at the pub after the lights go out. This is not a parade of neat answers. It is, instead, a sustained invitation to wonder, to skepticism, and to imagination. Imagine walking with me now. Picture a gray morning, damp air on your face, and a low sun trying to push through the mist. You and I are heading toward a field no tourist guide will name, past the hedgerow whose thorny branches snag your sleeve. The ground underfoot is soft, peaty in places, and you can feel a subtle irregularity, a low rise, a mound that looks too deliberate to be accidental. Locals call some of these places Lost Tombs, a romantic phrase that sounds like it belongs to a Gothic novel. But these are real depressions and ringed curbstones and, sometimes, the stubborn white of bones exposed by plow or storm. Archaeologists come with trowels and laser scanners. Folklorists come with notebooks. Teenagers come with flashlights and ghost stories. And each leaves with a different conviction about what happened here. That multiplicity, different, serious people seeing different truths in the same dirt, is the engine of our narrative. We will walk 6 to 8 of these mysteries across Normandy, some tucked in tidal marshes, some hidden under medieval vineyards, some appearing as neat biomorphic shapes on a satellite image and refusing to behave when examined up close. For each site we will sketch the world it would have been part of, the year, the climate, the trade routes that might have reached its gates, the technology of burial, the artifacts found and the puzzling absences. We'll read the scientific papers that tried to place it on a timeline. We will listen to the old wives' tales about skeletons as tall as plow horses and stone heads that cry when it rains. We'll take the competing theories seriously, from erosion to ritual to invasion, and we'll end each encounter with the same modest humility: we still don't know. But here's where it gets tricky. Normandy's landscape is a palimpsest. Romans reshaped fields the Gauls once used. Viking settlers reinterpreted older barrows, and medieval farmers borrowed stones from Bronze Age cairns to build farmhouses. That interleaving makes dating difficult. A grave cut into a pre-existing mound can carry artifacts from 3 different eras. Radiocarbon dates can cluster oddly. A single bone sample might reflect an animal older than the burial itself because of secondary use. And then there's the human factor, a generation of looters in the 18th and 19th centuries, often undocumented, who stripped tombs for curiosity or profit. So when modern tools, LIDAR, ground-penetrating radar, stable isotope analysis, report strange anomalies, you have to ask, are we seeing the residue of a single inexplicable event, or a layered biography written over centuries? This uncertainty is not a flaw. It is the very thing that makes these places sing. They are archives without a librarian, with pages ripped and glued together in a different order. We will hold both skepticism and wonder in equal measure. When a local grandmother swears the stones in a particular field will move on a certain saint's day, we will not dismiss her. Instead, we'll ask why such beliefs persist and whether they map onto natural phenomena, frost heave, seasonal water tables, animal activity, or onto a memory of events lost to formal history. When a lab reports trace elements in bronze pins indicating trade with the Mediterranean around 600 BC, we will examine the chain of custody and the sample size and then broaden the question: what would that trade look like? Small coins? Amber traded through multiple hands? A lost voyage that ferried ideas as well as goods? The point of this documentary is not to stake a claim but to trace the thought process of how we make meaning from fragments. We will move from the tactile, bone, pottery, grave goods, to the interpretive, social structure, ritual practice, mobility patterns. And always we will leave room for a myth that refuses to die, for a scientist's doubt, for your own imagination. Picture, too, the physicality of these places. The air tastes of clay and sea in some spots. In others, the scent is loam and manure. Winds roll like distant drums, and sometimes, at dusk, the shadows of the apple trees stretch like black hands. In the light, you can make out slight depressions and crescents where stones once stood. Up close, the bones are white and faintly iridescent in the dirt. A rib here, a jaw there, and you become aware of scale. Some burials are small, a child or a single adult with a few tokens, while others are vast, concentric rings of stone that must have taken hundreds of hands to build. Whole swathes of land were, at different times, reserved for the dead. That scale asks us the human question: who were these people, and how much did they invest in remembering their dead? The answer matters because it speaks to social bonds, to inequality, to ritual. An elaborate burial hints at hierarchy. A plain interment suggests equality or scarcity. But even plain burials can be enigmatic when they contain objects impossible to reconcile with their dating. A Mediterranean bead in a coastal marsh tomb. A large femur that suggests a person far taller than normal for their era. We will be precise with dates where we can be precise. For instance, situating Neolithic activity around 3500 to 2200 BC, Bronze Age monuments between 2200 to 800 BC, Roman era intrusions in the 1st to 4th centuries CE, and Viking influence in the 9th to 11th centuries. And we will be candid where dates are debated or inconclusive. Now let us begin with the first of our mysteries, a low, ringed earthwork near the Cotentin coastline, a place people call La Croix du Vide, the Cross of Emptiness, because of the yawning pit rumored to lie beneath its stones. One-sentence teaser. La Croix du Vide, a ring of curbstones 12 meters across, hides a burial chamber whose goods include an iron trident the size of a small sword and bones that test older than the grave itself. The site sits on a salt marsh edge where tidal channels have rearranged the coastline for millennia. Early surveys, in the 1970s, described a circular mound with a collapsed capstone and a scattering of human and animal bones. More systematic excavations in the 1990s obfuscated the timeline. Radiocarbon dates taken from charcoal near the base of the mound suggested an early Bronze Age construction around 1800 BC, while a fragment of iron trident recovered from the interior, an oddity, since substantial iron tools are generally later, yielded isotopic signatures consistent with bloomery forged iron from a northern workshop dated roughly to the 2nd century BC, a mismatch that sent ripples through the regional archaeological community. Trade routes could explain the trident. Iron goods moved widely, sometimes as heirlooms. Alternatively, the trident might be a later intrusive object inserted into an older mound, or, and here the sensational takes over, it might signal a revived burial tradition where later communities reappropriated ancient tombs to charge their rituals with antiquity. Still, for all the evidence, we do not have a neat sequence. Let's be fair. Several working hypotheses coexist. Hypothesis 1 posits that La Croix du Vide is a Bronze Age funerary monument reused by an Iron Age or pre-Roman group who inserted an iron trident as a status object or ritual offering. Hypothesis 2 suggests the trident is intrusive, dropped or lost in a later disturbance, perhaps a medieval plowing episode that overturned a later fill. Hypothesis 3, favored in some local oral histories, reads the site as a voyage marker, a signal placed by a seafaring people who used the mound as both a burial and a nautical landmark, and who later generations remembered as the cross that marks the empty sea. The championing of the nautical theory rests partly on fine contexts, marine mollusk incrustations on certain pottery fragments, and the geographic situation near tidal flows. Yet this too is complicated. Tidal action can redeposit marine material long after original burial. Now, imagine yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the reeds whispering, and seeing the circle of stones like the ribs of some sleeping beast. Picture the enormity of communal labor required to drag capstones across marshland. Picture hands, calloused and deliberate, arranging bodies and offerings beneath. Feel the hush that follows, a hush both like grief and like ritual satisfaction. Still, for all the evocative possibilities, for all the tests and dates and magnetometer maps, the chronology remains tangled. We still don't know whether the trident belonged to the mound's original builders, to later interlopers claiming its power, or to a dozen hands that passed it down across centuries. There is a mythic thread next to the archaeology. Villagers tell of giants who once crossed the marshes carrying stones the size of cottages. In one popular telling, when the giants quarreled, they hurled massive slabs into the fields and these became the ringed cairns. Children dare each other to touch a particular stone at midnight. Some swear it hums like a plucked string. Is that faint vibration a product of memory, folklore, or a real acoustic phenomenon? Scientists have measured ephemeral low-frequency noise in some monoliths, microresonances that occur when certain sediments and shapes interact with wind. Could the humming be a real physical resonance amplified by a stone's geometry and local winds? Possibly. Yet the giants remain a capacious figure into which people can pour their all. The giants tell us something crucial about human psychology. When confronted with extraordinary engineering feats, we translate them into extraordinary agents. That translation is itself a type of historical evidence of how communities relate to their ancient landscape. We will move from La Croix du Vide to the next mystery along a narrow, muddy lane where an old orchard borders a shallow hollow known in maps as Le Cercle de l'Ombre. The Circle of Shadow. A one-sentence teaser, Le Cercle de l'Ombre preserves a set of burials with staggered orientations. Some bodies face the east, others west, and among the bones are unusually large femora that suggest individuals far taller than the contemporaneous population. The site was first disturbed in the 1880s when a tenant farmer turned the soil, revealing a scatter of iron nails, bronze pins, and a cluster of long bones. A local antiquarian documented a few finds, but systematic investigation only began in the 2000s when a regional university team applied LIDAR and found beneath the orchard a subcircular anomaly consistent with a series of contiguous chambers. Osteological analysis of recovered remains complicated the story. Skeletal metrics suggested a bimodal population in terms of stature, with a minority of individuals exhibiting lengths in the upper tail of known distributions, not so large as to be mythic giants, but definitely outside normal variation for the period. Dietary isotope analysis suggested differing diets. Those with longer bones had a marine-rich isotopic signature indicating a high reliance on fish and shellfish, whereas the more ordinary individuals had isotope values consistent with mixed agriculture. That pattern invites hypotheses about social stratification or specialized occupational groups, fishermen versus farmers, but it also raises questions about mobility and gene flow. Could these taller individuals represent recent migrants from a population with different average statures? Or could they be local elites who consumed more protein and therefore achieved greater adult heights? Or, more sensationally, might they point toward a submerged memory of a lost tribe, remembered in later myth as people of great size? Now, let's be fair, there are mundane explanations that must be exhausted before leaping to the extraordinary. Environmental factors, such as vitamin-rich diets in certain estuarine communities, can produce taller statures without invoking migration. Sample size is critical. A handful of long femora can skew impressions if the wider population isn't represented in the data. And we must also consider excavation bias. Earlier looters and later plowing may have selectively removed smaller, less well-preserved skeletons. Yet the pattern persists at multiple nearby sites, which suggests regional significance. Picture yourself under the orchard's apple trees at dusk, the air thick with the sweet smell of fruit, and imagine kneeling in the soft earth to uncover a long bone. The discovery changes the scale of human possibility. A single femur can make us rethink the bodies that inhabited these landscapes, the nutrition they had, the social roles they played. It forces us to ask who is remembered and why. Still, for all the anatomical data and isotope charts, for all the maps and LIDAR imagery, the human stories remain partial. People told stories before there were labs and databases, and those stories can preserve truth in a compressed, symbolic form. The tale of tall fishermen who haunted the shoreline, told around hearths, may not be literal history, but it preserves a social memory of distinct groups operating side by side, outsiders and insiders, fisherfolk and tillers. Those social memories are themselves evidence. In this way, mythology does not contradict science, it complements it, offering hypotheses that science can test and human contexts that numbers alone cannot provide. And here, as elsewhere, the evidence nudges us into a delicate place between certainty and suggestion. These first two places, a ring mound at the edge of a marsh and an orchard hollow with tall skeletons, reveal a central motif that we will see again and again: continuity and reuse, overlap and contradiction. Normandy's dead are not neatly parceled into discrete eras. Instead, they form a braided archive in which objects move across centuries, where stones are scavenged and remade, and where ritual landscapes get reinterpreted by successive communities. We will soon turn to burial sites that suggest long-distance contact, beads that appear to have Mediterranean chemical signatures, pottery styles that echo insular Britain, and metallurgical traces that indicate ore sources from distant hills. We will also examine places where the earth itself seems to resist excavation, hollows that collapse around trench edges, sediment layers that refuse to yield datable carbon, residues so degraded that only microstratigraphy and patient sampling will suggest a sequence. These methodological frustrations are not mere setbacks, they are part of the story. They remind us that archaeology is an act of translation across deep time, a conversation with absences as much as with artifacts. Before I close this session, picture again the tactile details: the weight of a small bronze pin in your palm, its green patina like the color of old money, the slight hollowness underfoot where a chamber once was, the way a single bone can centuries later tilt our sense of what was possible. Feel also the emotional tenor, respect for the dead, curiosity that refuses to stop at neat explanations, and the humility of modern methods when confronted with layered human lives. We are not fortune-tellers. We are interpreters at a debris-strewn desk. Our task is modest and yet profound: to assemble, as carefully as possible, a narrative that honors both the rigor of science and the resonant threads of human imagination. We move on, deeper into the marshes, towards salt-smelled horizons and low, wind-shaped knolls, because the landscape keeps giving us new puzzles, and because each new puzzle widens the frame of what we think we know about Normandy's past. The next place we will explore rests where land and sea continually negotiate with one another, a place locals call Baie des Ombres, the Bay of Shadows, and scholars simply list as a cluster of submerged barrows mapped along a receding shoreline. One-sentence teaser: the submerged barrows of Baie des Ombres are a line of low, stone-ringed mounds now half-sunken into tidal flats, containing goods that point to far-flung connections, amphora fragments with Mediterranean clay signatures and a string of amber beads chemically matching Baltic sources. The bay's modern shoreline is a pale, shifting thing. In some centuries it has advanced, in others it has retreated, leaving behind ghostly outlines of former dunes and drowned fields. Early cartographers noted anomalies in the tidal channels here. Fishermen spoke of hummocks that snagged nets at low tide and of a chill that could make a man's teeth rattle. When remote sensing surveys finally took an interest, LIDAR and side-scan sonar revealed a series of low ridges and circular scars, each roughly 6 to 12 meters across, aligned like beads on a string parallel to an ancient coastline that no longer exists. Excavations that sampled just enough to be provocative, not exhaustive, because working in intertidal cemetery is like trying to read a letter written in water, brought up pottery sherds, a scatter of small beads, and a number of disarticulated human bones whose isotopic fingerprints suggested diets alternately heavy in fish and in terrestrial grains. The most unsettling artifact, at least for specialists, was an amphora rim whose clay composition matched those commonly used in the Western Mediterranean during the Late Iron Age, roughly the 4th to 1st centuries BC. Alongside it, A string of beads yielded an elemental profile consistent with Baltic amber, which archaeological chemists usually expect in northern trade networks rather than in seaside marshes of northwestern France. But here's where it gets tricky. Traded goods move in strange ways. An amphora rim can arrive by direct trade, by down-the-line exchange, as a prized heirloom, or as cargo from a shipwreck. The amphora's clay signature tells us it was produced in the western Mediterranean basin, yet the rim itself showed heavy biofouling and abrasion, suggesting long exposure to seawater either before deposition or as a result of being moved by tides. One hypothesis reads Beta Ambers as a coastal trading node where Atlantic and Mediterranean networks bridged. Fishermen and mariners who plied the nearby channels may have acquired foreign goods in ports to the south or through intermediaries along the channel coasts. Another hypothesis posits shipwreck deposition. A vessel carrying mixed cargo foundered and its goods, redistributed by currents and local scavengers, were later incorporated into burial contexts as the shoreline shifted. A third possibility is ritual deposition along a liminal landscape, a place where fresh water and salt water meet, a traditional threshold that cultures often use for offerings to the dead or to deities of the sea. In many parts of pre-industrial Europe, bodies of water are memory points where the living mark transitions. The presence of rich or foreign goods could reflect attempts to anchor the dead in networks that extended beyond the local parish. Now, let's be fair, taphonomy, the study of how bodies and objects decay and move after death, complicates every neat narrative. Currents can rework contexts, storms can pluck out layers, and centuries of salt can leach trace elements into ceramics and beads, slightly shifting their chemical fingerprint. Still, the pattern here, a geographic alignment, repeated bead types, and multiple fragments with non-local signatures, hints at more than a single shipwreck fluke. Picture yourself standing on the bay in a wind that moves like an instrument, feeling grit under your boots. Imagine the sound of gulls, the smell of seaweed, and the way low tide opens a pale map of channels and mudflats. Picture kneeling beside one of the low rings of stones. There is a faint, salty crust along the upper stones, and when you brush away the silt, you reveal not one skeleton but a scatter, child bones mixed with adult bones, shells, and sherds. The intermixing is messy, it resists tidy social interpretations like, "This is an elite cemetery," or, "This is a fisherman's burial ground." Instead, it suggests a liminal place used repeatedly for different purposes over centuries, sometimes by people who had access to distant trade goods and sometimes by those who did not. Myth rides along this archaeological shore like a fog. A drowned city motif circulates in many local tales. Villagers tell of an ancient hamlet swallowed by the sea when men grew too proud or when a priest stole a relic and the waters took vengeance. There's an oral fragment, perhaps Victorian in origin, perhaps older, about a bridal procession walking along the old shoreline when it collapsed and took all the wedding candles with it. Those candles, the story suggests, are sometimes visible beneath the water on certain still nights. Are these stories nothing but moralistic parables invented to explain coastal instability? Or are they compressed memories of catastrophic events, sudden inundations, storm surges, episodic subsidence, that terrified and moved communities? Scientific sea level reconstructions do indicate episodes of relative sea level rise and storm-driven erosion in certain centuries, which could plausibly underwrite such tales. Myth, in short, may encode a kernel of geological truth, emotionalized and refracted through generations. Beyond myth and chemistry, Beta Ambers prompts a broader question about identity and mobility in the ancient Atlantic world. How mobile were coastal communities, and how porous were regional boundaries? The beads and amphora rims suggest networks that stitch together far-flung peoples, merchants, mariners, refugees, or perhaps ritual specialists who sought items with symbolic value from distant places. That breadth of possibility invites us to imagine not stagnant, insular villages but dynamic, connected communities negotiating identity against an unsteady shoreline. And it invites humility. We can map traces, measure isotopes, and model currents, but the people who made choices, who buried a child with a bead, who set a pot rim in a shallow grave, are lost behind a veil of time. We still don't know whether Beta Ambers function primarily as a trading enclave, a ritual threshold for offerings, or a landscape repeatedly reworked by sea and human hands. From the bay we climb inland, away from salt air toward a chalk spine that ranks monarchs' old hunting grounds and terraced pastures. There, on a rounded knoll overlooking a brook, stands a site that confounds the usual progression of pottery typologies and metalworking stages. A roughly rectangular earthwork girded by heavy, quarried slabs, inside which a stone-lined chamber held a wooden coffin and an iron object that looks, to modern eyes, suspiciously like a church bell's clapper. The one-sentence teaser reads, "The iron chapel of Mont Saint Loup hides a stone sarcophagus inside a rectangular cairn, filled with charred bone and an iron mass whose metallurgical analysis points to advanced smelting techniques not matched elsewhere in the region until centuries later." Archaeologists first noticed the mound from aerial photography in the 1990s. Subsequent test pits revealed an internal arrangement unlike the circular or oval barrows more typical of Bronze Age norms. The dimensions are precise. The cairn measures roughly 9.5 by 6.5 meters internally, with a stone threshold 3 meters across. Within, a stone-lined chamber 2.2 meters long held a collapsed wooden coffin. The coffin's charred remains indicate intense burning prior to deposition or a later funeral pyre incorporated into the burial. Among the remains, shard analysis showed a mixture of coarse local wares and a few imported pieces, and the iron object, at once heavy and oddly shaped, returned an isotopic signature that suggested extraction and smelting techniques strikingly advanced compared to contemporaneous local metallurgy. Now, here's where professional caution gives way to narrative temptation. One team hypothesized that Mont Saint Loup marks a transitional rite, a community experimenting with hybrid burial forms as they adopted new religious symbols and technologies. Another posited that the iron mass could be a symbolic anvil, representing craft or authority, placed with the dead as a status marker. A more radical suggestion, aired in a small conference paper and then picked up by alternative history bloggers, imagines a lost metallurgical school, a small, geographically localized innovation, that briefly developed techniques ahead of its time and was later erased by social upheaval. The later theory appeals to those who love the dramatic arc of forgotten genius, but it wrestles with a hard reality. Metallurgical progress usually leaves a trail, slag heaps, workshops, or pits. Mont Saint Loup offers an isolated hint without the expected industrial hinterland. Could such an innovation be a single itinerant smith's work, a transplanted craftsperson working in isolation? Or does the iron object arrive from a later intrusion, perhaps a medieval plundering that left the object embedded in older deposits? Let's be fair, radiocarbon dates taken from the charred coffin would produce a cluster centering around the late Iron Age to early Roman transition, roughly the 1st century BC to the 1st century CE. But the iron isotopes indicated ore processing signatures more commonly attributed to later Bloomery methods of the early medieval period. That mismatch is maddening and fascinating in equal measure. It forces us to consider multistage deposition, a late prehistoric burial that was reopened in a later age, with the iron object inserted then. Or perhaps the stratigraphy was disturbed by later construction activities, sheepfolds built into older mounds, medieval reuse of stones. These are mundane but plausible pathways that often defeat the more romantic explanations. Still, the site hums with evocative possibilities. Picture yourself ascending the slope to Mont Saint Loup, the grass bent by an easterly wind. Imagine the stone lintel at the cairn's mouth, smooth from countless hands, and picture opening the chamber to find the ghost of charred wood and the dense, cold weight of iron. Imagine a community at a moment of change, new materials, new rites, and an old cairn repurposed to anchor fresh meanings. The charred coffin suggests fire as ritual, perhaps a cremation integrated with inhumation, a hybrid that resists tidy classification. The human impulse to mark transitions with objects of power, iron, stone, imported pottery, surfaces again, reminding us that burial practices often double as social signals. Even if the iron mass proves to be a later insertion, the act of reintegration tells us something about continuity. People return to old places to assert new identities. And then there's the story that villagers tell of Mont Saint Loup's iron bell, that on certain fog-bound evenings, a faint tolling occurs from the hill though no bell has hung there in living memory. Acoustic studies of the hills show that wind patterns can create tonal phenomena when they sweep across stone thresholds and hollow chambers. Certain frequencies can resonate and produce sounds the ear interprets as tolling. Science may offer a physical explanation for this atmospheric bell, but the story persists because it gives the site moral texture. It's a place where the sound of the past literally rings out to remind the living of obligations, to remember, to attend, to bury properly. Myth and science, again, coexist without necessarily collapsing into one another. Mont St. Loup presses on the larger themes of our exploration: technological anomaly, ritual reuse, and the human desire to connect present acts to ancestral prestige. It shows how a single object, an iron mass without a clear function, can ripple into whole narratives about innovation, migration, and identity. It also reminds us of research's provisionality. Every interpretation carries caveats and competing scenarios, and every data point must be situated within messy human history. We still don't know whether Mont St. Loup marks a small center of advanced metallurgy, a later intrusion into an older tomb, or a ritual act of reinvention. These two new sites, the submerged, trade-rich barrows of Baie des Ambres and the puzzling iron chamber of Mont St. Loup, broaden our landscape. They show trade networks both literal and symbolic, and they expose the challenges of reading places repeatedly rewritten by people, water, and time. We have now covered 4 of our mystery segments. There are more to come, each bringing its own tangle of artifacts, dates, and tales. For now, hold the images of salt-slick barrows and a stone chamber that once rang like a bell in your mind. Feel the push and pull between the certainties of lab analyses and the stubborn persistence of local lore. The next installment will take us into upland tumuli where stone sculptures with baffling iconography stand watch, and into riverine graves where objects suggest voyagers whose language and origins we can only guess at. If you'd like me to continue now, I will proceed with the next segments in the same style, carrying forward the same balance of detail, skepticism, and wonder. We push on, following a faint cart track that climbs into chalk country where wind scours the ridgelines and the light turns thin and bright. Up here the soil is chalky and pale, and the horizon is long. It favors monuments because stones show against the sky and cairns can be seen for miles. The next place we come to is a ring of low tumuli crowned with stone slabs, each slab incised with crude anthropomorphic figures whose strokes are either purely geometric nor obviously Christian. Sculptures whose faces look back at us with a kind of deliberate ambiguity. One-sentence teaser: the chalk guardians are a scattering of carved megaliths set around tombs, their iconography like no canonical catalog and their carving tools and techniques puzzlingly advanced for their radiocarbon window. The site sits on a promontory that would have commanded views of former seaways and inland tracks, which makes it an apt place for signals and memory. Local farmer families have known about the stones for generations. They graze sheep nearby and call the place Les Guardians, when the moon is full and the air tastes of salt carried inland. Archaeologists first took formal notice when a forestry contractor cutting a small stand of trees exposed a previously hidden slab in the 1960s. Later surveys in the 1980s and then high-resolution photogrammetry in the 2010s revealed a pattern: stones positioned at cardinal nodes around earthen mounds, each carved with figures whose proportions vary. Some stylized with elongated faces and pierced eyes, others with robust torsos and incised belts. Dating the site has been vexing. Organic material associated with the tumuli, charred grain, tiny fragments of bone, tends to yield late Neolithic to early Bronze Age ranges, roughly 3000 to 1800 BC for several samples, which places the construction deep in prehistory. Yet the tools implied by the stonework, particularly the precision of certain grooves and the presence of peck marks that suggest repeated tool strikes at specific angles, have led a few specialists to argue that some sculptural elements are of a later reworking, perhaps Iron Age or even Roman in origin. One working view is that the tumuli are essentially prehistoric cairns that were later modified, with the stone slabs recarved or repurposed during times of renewed ritual use. Another view proposes that the sculptures represent a single long-lived tradition that persisted regionally in a form of conservative visual language, surviving with remarkable fidelity across centuries. A tantalizing third hypothesis, entertained in a cautious footnote in a journal article, suggests cross-cultural influence. Certain motifs, concentric eyes, raised belts, vertical incisions, bear formal affinities to carved stones found in parts of Brittany and even to some megalithic iconography of the British Isles. If so, the chalk guardians might belong to a web of Atlantic visual forms shared across seaways, signaling long-range cultural dialogues we have only just begun to map. Material analysis deepens the mystery. Microscopic where patterns on some incised lines reveal a sequence of tool use, coarse pecking with hammerstones followed by finer abrading and, in one case, a final polish on a facial plane that suggests attention to finish rather than mere function. That polish is odd for a life on exposed ridgelines. Wind and frost would erode such care quickly, so one inference is that the polished faces are later, or that the original makers intended the finish to catch light in a ritual moment, perhaps aligned with a solstice sunrise or a particular star. Soil chemistry beneath the slabs shows traces of ochre in several spots, meaning pigment was applied at some point. Pigmented stonework shifts the mental image, not gray, weathered monoliths but colored faces once bright against a boy's or girl's sky. Imagine them standing in their primacy, painted eyes under a sky so clear the horizon looks like a knife. Imagine people dressed in hide and linen circling them, smoke from ritual fires painting the faces golden. The human imagination is vivid here because the physical evidence permits it. Still, for all the craftsmanship and the whispers of long-range networks, the social interpretation resists certainty. Were the carvings guardians in a quasi-animist sense, embodiments of ancestors or territorial spirits? Or were they permanent markers of lineage and claim, statements about who controlled the ridge and its resources? Perhaps they were mnemonic devices, visual prompts that anchored oral histories and genealogies in stone. All these hypotheses have merit and all rely on partial evidence. Items of personal adornment found in situ suggest some burials were high status, while others are plain pits. Osteological analysis indicates age distributions consistent with a population that included infants and the elderly, which argues against an exclusively elite burial ground. Here again we are reminded that monuments can serve multiple roles across generations: mausolea for one century, boundary markers for another, sacred theater for the next. There is a mythic overlay that refuses to let these stones be mere static objects. Villagers recount a tale of three sisters who carved their own faces into stone to ward off a marauding chieftain. Another persistent rumor speaks of the stones as petrified soldiers who were turned to stone by a witch's curse when they disobeyed a god. These tales, obviously non-literal, nevertheless carry a sociocultural weight. They enforce local moral orders and help people reckon with landscape features that otherwise lack an explanatory anchor. Myth, again, acts like a social hypothesis that demands testing. If a stone is said to bring luck to sheep flocks, shepherds may behave differently around it, fostering trust and stewardship that affects preservation. The stories, therefore, actively shape the archaeological record by influencing human behavior across generations. Now imagine yourself here at midday, the ridgeline warm underfoot, sheep bleating distantly, and the carved faces turned into the sun. You run a gloved hand along an incised cheek and feel the grooves smoothed by millennia of rain and touch. You imagine a communal hands-on ritual that once animated these faces: the placement of offerings, the painting of ochre, the chanting of names that no longer survive. You feel, too, the weight of continuity. A place that generations have returned to because it held meaning that outlived single lifetimes. And yet, for all the tactile detail, for all the stylistic comparisons and isotopic analyses, we cannot conclusively map the carved iconography to a specific belief system or genealogy of influence. We still don't know whether the chalk guardians are the product of long-lived local tradition, the material expression of a cross-channel visual language, or the layered result of repeated recarving across centuries. From the chalk we turn to the river, following a tributary that threads into the main artery of the region. Rivers are natural highways, and the next site sits on a meander where an ancient landing may once have funneled people and goods. The one-sentence teaser reads, "The River of Masks is a stretch of graves where funerary goods include masks or mask-like faceplates fashioned in bone and wood, objects whose style suggests ritual performance, and whose materials hint at trade with distant shores." The discovery came when a flood in the mid-1990s cut into a bank and revealed a series of inhumations. Subsequent controlled excavations discovered not only bodies but cache pits containing wooden fragments, bone appliques, and a variety of perishable items that survive only in waterlogged conditions. Waterlogging is a miracle in archaeology because it preserves organics that normally rot, wood grain, basketry impressions, leather straps, and that allowed the team to recover delicate mask fragments whose form implies they were worn or displayed in a ceremonial context. Radiocarbon dates from the waterlogged would place the burials roughly in the late Roman to early medieval transition, about the 3rd to 7th century CE, a period of astonishing mobility and cultural fusion as Roman structures collapsed and new polities rose. The masks themselves are stylistically fractious. Some are simple ovals with eye holes and drilled perforations suggesting attachment to leather. Others are carved bone plates with geometric incisions that echo continental motifs known from nearer the Baltic or even earlier Latin art styles. A few small inlaid glass tesserae hint at high-status ornamentation perhaps acquired through coastal trade. Chemical analysis of residues on one plate detected traces of pine tar and resinous compounds likely used as adhesives or weatherproofing, substances used in seafaring contexts. Faunal analysis also tells a story. In several graves, fish vertebrae and seabird bones are found alongside human remains, suggesting communities with diets tied to river and sea and possibly identities connected to marine livelihoods. The interpretive field is wide. Masks in funerary contexts might suggest ancestor veneration wherein the deceased is represented or transformed through a face object. They could indicate performance rites, actors wearing masks to enact myths that accompanied funerals, or they might be protective devices thought to ward off spirits. The presence of marine materials, combined with stylistic ties to continental motifs, suggests cultural permeability. Riverine communities acted as nodes on networks that stretched from Brittany to the North Sea and across to the Baltic in goods and ideas. That said, none of these hypotheses is decisive. Could masks be heirlooms, traded objects whose symbolic potency transcended their geographic origin? Could they have been made locally by artisans imitating foreign styles because those motifs were prestigious? Each explanation carries different implications for identity, mobility, and social structure. Another tantalizing dimension emerges from osteological data. Several skeletons show evidence of healed trauma, particular fractures on the forearms and shoulders that are consistent with falls from height or repetitive strain from pulling with ropes, plausible markers of seafaring work. Other skeletons present enamel hypoplasia, reflective of physiological stress during childhood, while some show isotopic signatures of diets rich in marine protein. Taken together, the evidence sketches a mixed community of specialists, some people living long enough to show healed injuries and durable tool-use marks, others whose early life stress suggests hardship. This blend hints at an integrated economy, perhaps where itinerant mariners found seasonal security, and where locals provided agricultural staples. Now, picture the river at dawn, mist clutching the surface like cloth. A narrow boat slips out from a shaded bend, and at its stern a masked figure stands silhouetted, a ritual torch extinguished and handed to the water. In your mind's eye, the mask catches light and becomes a liminal object, either fully human nor purely effigy. It marks transition, from life to death, from one social role to another. The physical artifacts, bone plates, wooden frames, glued glass, are humble but capacious, suggesting practices that privilege performative transformation. And yet, for all the evocative materiality, we cannot say whether the masks are common across the region or unique to this riverine node, whether they denote ethnic boundaries or craft guilds, whether they signal direct contact with Baltic artisans or imitate a pan-European repertoire. We still don't know. The river graves introduce another essential motif for our Normandy story, the permeability of cultural boundaries. Trade, migration, marriage, pilgrimage, all these mechanisms move objects, people, and ideas across landscapes. They produce hybrid forms that resist neat classification. When we find bone masks with glass inlay, it is tempting to draw a tidy line from A to B, artisans in city X taught makers in village Y. But reality often moves through chains of exchange and imitation, through itinerant craftsmen and seasonal markets where locals choose what to adopt and what to reject. The masks, in other words, are less a map of direct contact than the residue of choices made by people at the margins of seaways and rivers. Before we leave the river, consider the role of chance in preservation. Many places do not survive the record because of soil acidity, plowing, sea level changes, or simple neglect. That a set of masks exists here at all is partly an accident of preservation and partly a testament to the practices of the people who chose waterlogged ground for burial. The choice of a riverbank as a funerary locus might itself be a deliberate strategy to preserve objects for the dead, a cultural technology of memory. If so, then the river of masks is not only a repository of artifacts but evidence of a conscious strategy. These people wanted their masks to last, and they found a way. We will return to these threads, the carved stones, the masks, the interplay of myth and science, as we unfold further segments. For now, hold the images of carved faces in chalk and masked figures crossing a fog-bound river. Feel how these objects open the past, not as tidy textbooks but as provocations, invites to think about mobility, ritual, and artistic conversation. Remember that every artifact is stubbornly partial. It tells a story and hides others. We are learning to read this palimpsest with better tools, photogrammetry, microchemistry, isotopic profiles, and with better questions, not just who made an object, but why that object mattered, how people used it to remember and remake identity, and how they negotiated the borderlines between land and sea, ancestors and present. Yet despite the precision of modern science and the eloquence of local lore, many of these questions remain open. We still don't know. We climb now to a hillside necropolis that crowns a long slope above a shallow valley where, on a clear day, you can see the ribbon of a distant road and the glint of a river. The place is quiet in a way that physical silence sometimes is not. It carries a low tension, as if the stones themselves wait for some calendrical signal. One-sentence teaser. The long alignment necropolis arranges graves along precise orientations that correlate with solar and lunar rising points on specific dates. And within those graves are grave goods organized not by status alone but by a pattern that suggests a cosmological code. Archaeologists first mapped the necropolis from aerial photography and magnetometer sweeps. The plan revealed a sequence of long, narrow ditches and aligned tombs stretching nearly 100 meters along a ridgeline, each tomb offset from the next by a remarkably consistent angular increment. Radiocarbon dates from sealed contexts, charcoal from cremation urns and small fragments of willow bark used as shrouds, clustered in a window roughly between 900 and 500 BC, situating the necropolis in the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, a period known elsewhere in northwestern Europe for rising cosmological interest and complex funerary displays. The measurable precision of the alignments startled some researchers. When plotted against the horizon, several tomb axes intersected solar risings on equinoxes and solstices, and a handful pointed toward lunar standstill positions that recur only on an 18.6-year cycle. What makes the necropolis especially intriguing is not only the astronomical orientation, but the systematic arrangement of objects within each tomb. When the archaeologists opened the sealed stone cists, they found not a random assortment of goods but a repeated inventory pattern, a modular set of items, a small polished flint mirror, a ceramic cup with a thin ring of blackened residue on its lip, a string of small faience beads, and in some cases, a small iron pin, placed at consistent relative positions to the body's head, chest, and feet. This repetition suggests ritual codification. Each burial was not only an act of interment but an enacted text, perhaps a liturgical formula intended to guide the deceased through a cosmological itinerary. Microstratigraphic analysis of the floor deposits beneath the bodies showed traces of plant ashes and linear bands that could indicate processional paths inside the tomb, or a ritual laying out of offerings before closure. The variety in the assemblages, some tombs richer than others, some containing additional exotic items like a single Mediterranean shell or a sliver of bronze worked with foreign alloying, hints at social differentiation, but the consistent modularity suggests that even inequality followed common rules. Interpretations diverge in compelling ways. One line of thought proposes that the necropolis functioned as a calendrical anchor, a communal clock, by which seasons and ritual dates were tracked, with burials staged to coincide with recurring celestial events and objects serving as mnemonic keys. Another hypothesis sees the alignment pattern as a political statement. Elite lineages laid out their dead to demonstrate cosmological knowledge, thereby legitimizing claims to authority through sacred knowledge. A third reads the pattern as a more performative ritual choreography in which the living enacted myths of death and rebirth by placing standardized items to symbolize stages on an imagined journey to the afterlife. Each of these views has support. Ethnographic analogies show societies using burials to broadcast calendrical claims. The repeatability of objects across tombs points to ritual formulae, and the presence of certain exotic goods suggests exchange networks that provided symbolic materials. Yet practical issues complicate the neat narratives. Erosion and later plowing disturb peripheral tombs. Earlier, undocumented antiquarian interventions removed some key marker stones, and natural processes sometimes shifted small objects within cyst fills, creating ambiguity about original placement. There are also biological puzzles. Osteological study indicates an adult population with a prevalence of degenerative joint disease in the lower back and knees, evidence of repetitive heavy labor, but also a small subset of individuals with cranial modifications consistent with intentional shaping during childhood. Those cranial differences correlate with slightly different grave assemblages. Modified skull individuals tended to receive more beads and the flint mirrors, suggesting a possible marker of identity or status that was enacted physically from early life. Is cranial shaping a marker of social status, an ethnic marker of a migrating group, or a rite of passage that conferred membership in a ritual cohort? Each answer maps a different social topology onto the necropolis, and each remains contested. Local tradition wraps a poetic veil around the necropolis. Villagers call one long trench the Path of the Stars, and insist that at midnight on the longest night, flickers of light run the length of the tombs like a procession. Scientists who set up low-light cameras recorded nothing luminous, but they did note small thermal currents moving across the ridgeline as cooler valley air rose and mixed with daytime warmed slopes. In starlit conditions, optical effects and human pattern recognition can conspire to make ordinary things seem extraordinary. That said, the social ritual described in folklore, a night procession, a communal performance, dovetails with the idea that burials operated as performative spectacles that bound communities together. Imagine standing at the edge of the necropolis as dusk thickens, men and women walking slowly with torches, placing standardized items in order, and closing each tomb with the same liturgy. Picture a community marking time and identity simultaneously, using the landscape as both calendar and cathedral. The necropolis insistently suggests that these people negotiated their place in the cosmos through ritualized burial, that death was a public technology for remembering and organizing the living. And yet, despite the alignments, the objects, and the performative clues, we still do not have a definitive reading of the necropolis's social language. Are the alignments a communal calendrical device, a political assertion, or a ritual choreography with a mythic narrative now lost? We still don't know. From the hill we move west to a coastal promontory that fingers out toward the channel, a place where the wind is sharp and the waves keep a steady metronome. Here lies the smallest and most haunting of our sights, the Cove of Small Things, a concentration of child burials and tiny crafted items that have long since entered local lore as votive of sacrifice, of plague, or of protection. One-sentence teaser: the Cove of Small Things contains numerous infant and child burials clustered in a way that diverges from domestic cemeteries, accompanied by miniature tools, tiny ceramic vessels, and finely carved whistles, objects that may indicate child-specific rites, votive deposition, or the archaeological signature of a crisis. Historians first learned of the cove in a trove of parish records noting a rector's complaint in the 14th century about children being buried at the cliff, rather than in consecrated ground, a marginal note that hints at long-standing practice. Archaeologists, using careful test trenches and water table control, discovered tightly clustered graves, many oriented toward the sea, and all containing small, carefully made objects, tiny knives of flint, reduced scale bowls, and a preponderance of whistles carved from bird bone whose apertures showed where consistent with being played. Dating these burials has been surprisingly difficult. The organic preservation in the salt-saturated cliff soil is poor, and while a few samples of textile fibers and a fragment of tiny cordage produce radiocarbon ages clustering around two separate windows, one medieval, roughly 1200 to 1400 C, and the other much earlier, about 600 to 400 BC. The stratigraphic intersection is complicated by cliff erosion and periodic slumping. That suggests two possible readings: either the cove served as a recurrent ritual locus used in multiple epochs, or the modern deposits have been reworked from older sediments by cliff collapse. If the earlier dating is robust, it implies long-term cultural continuity or reuse. If the medieval dates are primary, it suggests practices born in medieval crisis, perhaps a response to disease or unusual child mortality that created ritual responses outside church-sanctioned norms. The miniature objects themselves demand interpretation. Tiny tools could be toys, but their careful manufacture and placement with the dead point to an intentional ritual function beyond mere playthings. Whistles carved from bird bone are especially evocative. Ethnographic parallels sometimes use sound-producing objects in rites meant to guide spirits, or call ancestors. In other contexts, they function as transitional tokens to mark a liminal state for the dead. The presence of whistles suggests performance, perhaps lullaby-like songs to ease the passage of children into an imagined afterlife, or sonic markers that differentiated child burials from adult rites. The miniature bowls and knives could be symbolic provisions scaled to the size of the deceased, an echo of larger funerary provisioning traditions. Yet the recurrence of tiny blades, some with evidence of careful retouching and edge wear, raises a thornier possibility. Were these items functional in life, tools associated with a particular ritual practice that involved children? That hypothesis is delicate and dangerous if interpreted as evidence for child sacrifice. Given the ethical weight, researchers have been careful. Demographic analysis of the interred suggests a range of ages: neonates, infants under 1 year, and a number of toddlers, with no clear sign of violence as a primary cause of death in most osteological profiles. This pattern leans away from systematic ritual killing and more toward mortuary responses to high infant mortality, or to special rites for those who died in infancy. Local myth elaborates the cove with heartbreaking detail. Older residents tell of little boats, of wood placed for the dead, of songs hummed at dusk, and of an old woman, a midwife archetype, who once walked the cliff and left whistles for children so they would not be afraid. Many of these stories coalesce around a moral sensibility. The living ritualize their grief, creating practices that both mark difference: child burials apart from the churchyard, and enacted care beyond death. The cliff itself, a liminal place between land and sea, amplifies the theme of transition. Picture the promontory at sunset, gulls wheeling, a small cluster of white markers near the edge, and the hushed sound of someone playing a tiny bone whistle so high and thin it may not be audible beyond a few yards. The scene turns grief into practice and isolation into community ritual. We must remain cautious. The medieval parish complaint about burials at the cliff could reflect ecclesiastical jurisdiction contests rather than a condemnation of child-specific rites. The older radiocarbon window might indicate isolated reuse or contamination from older sediment reworking. Yet the emotional weight is undeniable. People who lose children often create ritual forms that do not neatly map onto formal liturgy. The Cove of Small Things forces us to confront the human dimension behind the artifact lists: grief, improvisation, care, and the desire to make meaning when social systems fail to contain loss. That urgency, more than sensational conjecture, should temper our interpretations. We still don't know whether the cove represents long-standing child-specific rites, emergency responses in times of crisis, or layered practices shaped by environmental change and ecclesiastical oversight. But in any of those possibilities, the cove speaks decisively about how communities adapt ritual to address the unbearable. We have now walked 8 distinct sites: La Croix du Vide, Le Cercle de l'Ombre, Baie des Ombres, Mont Saint-Loup, the Chalk Guardians, the River of Masks, the Long Alignment Necropolis, and the Cove of Small Things. Each expands the frame through which we imagine Normandy's past: ritual landscapes, reused stones, traded goods, body modification, astronomical knowledge, and the intimate pain of child loss. Each resists tidy conclusions and insists that archaeology is an art of provisional stories built on fragments. Carry those images with you: ringed stones at dawn, long femora in orchard soil, amphora rims glinting with salt, a charred coffin and an enigmatic iron mass, painted stone faces on a chalk ridge, masked figures on a misty river, a procession under stars, and a cliffside cluster of tiny whistles and bowls. These are not just curiosities. They are the residue of people negotiating existence, identity, loss, and memory across centuries. We still don't know. Close your eyes for a moment and let the last few images come back. The circle of curbstones at La Croix du Vide, a trident whose metal refuses to sit neatly in a single century. The long femora in Le Cercle de l'Ombre that demand we think again about the bodies who work these coasts. The amphora rim and Baltic beads of Baie d'Ambers, tide-scoured proof that goods and stories moved farther than our maps would suggest. The charred coffin and mysterious iron mass at Mont Saint-Loup ringing like a question in the hill. The carved faces of the chalk guardians surveying the world in painted stares. The river graves with their masked fragments and glues that whisper of performance. The ridgeline necropolis whose alignments read like a people's astronomy. The cove of small things where whistles and tiny bowls make grief audible and small. Hold all of those impressions not as discrete curiosities but as facets of a single human conversation stretched across millennia. People making meaning with stone and bone and metal, marking belonging and loss, and staking claims on the landscape that outlived their lifetimes. What binds these places is not a single plot we can easily narrate, but a set of recurring human impulses. First, there is the impulse to memorialize. Whether through monumental cairns requiring hundreds of hands or the careful placement of a child's whistle in cliff soil, people invest labor and imagination in remembering. These acts of memory are the social glue of communities. They affirm lineage and ownership, they make grief legible, and they allow groups to rehearse identity across generations. We see this in the repeated assemblages in the necropolis, in the painted faces of the chalk guardians, and in the choice to bury at liminal places like riverbanks and tidal flats. Each choice, place, object, orientation, is an encoded message. The challenge for us is not just to read the message but to understand who its intended audience was and how it functioned within a living community. Second, there is the impulse to connect. The amphora rim and Baltic amber, the glass tesserae and mask inlays, and the metallurgical oddities at Mont Saint-Loup all testify to networks. People in ancient Normandy were not hermits on a placid plain. They were nodes in wider circuits of trade, marriage, migration, and imitation. Goods could be prized not just for utility but for symbolic potency. An imported bead could confer status or link a family to a wider cosmology of value. The river, the sea, and even hill tracks are less mere geography than infrastructure of meaning, routes through which objects and ideas flowed. But flow is messy. Items moved via direct contact, through chains of exchange, as heirlooms, and by chance in shipwrecks. The archaeological record preserves the residue of those movements, but seldom the story of how or why an item changed hands. Thus the challenge, to map movement without collapsing it into simple trade lines or romantic voyages of discovery. Third, there is the impulse to perform and to ritualize. Many of the things we unearth are not merely possessions but props and acts meant to transform individuals and communities. The masks at the river, the modular placements in the necropolis, the whistles at the cliff, these objects suggest ceremonies where sound, light, and placement mattered. Ritual is a technology of meaning, a way to order grief, to consecrate authority, to translate the ephemeral into repeatable action. When we encounter repeating patterns, the same mirror and cup arrangement across tombs, what we may be seeing is a funerary liturgy, a script that taught people their roles in the story of life and death. That such liturgies insist upon both conformity, shared items and orientations, and difference, status markers, exotic inclusions, tells us about social boundaries, how communities unify and how they distinguish. Fourth, there is the impulse to reinterpret. People reuse stones, reinterpret old monuments, and insert new items into older mounds. The landscape, in that sense, is a living text edited by successive readers. Mont Saint-Loup's iron mass, La Croix du Vide's trident, and the recarved faces of the chalk guardians all remind us that monuments are palimpsests. A Bronze Age cairn can be an Iron Age shrine, can be a medieval boundary marker. That continuity and reuse complicate our chronological instincts but enrich the narrative. Reuse signals reverence, appropriation, and the deliberate invocation of an ancestor's aura. It tells us that the past has agency in the present. People animate the ghost of earlier authority to legitimate their own. Fifth, there is the persistent companionship of myth. Giants flinging stones, bells that toll on foggy nights, bridal processions swallowed by the sea. These are not mere folklore adornments to be politely filed away. They are cultural reactions to the scale, strangeness, and endurance of monuments. Myth translates engineering feats into human-scale stories and anchors abstract phenomena, erosion, tidal subsidence, acoustic resonance, in moral and social narratives. When a community says a stone hums or that children are carried off to a drowned hamlet, they are not simply lying, they are encoding environmental memory, social caution, and existential meaning. Folklore can guide archaeologists to features worth investigating. Sometimes it preserves memory when other records have faded. The interplay of myth and measurement is not an impediment to truth but a different register of it. All of these impulses play out against a stubborn background of methodological humility. Techniques like LIDAR, isotopic analysis, radiocarbon dating, photogrammetry, and microstratigraphy are powerful, but they do not dispense with ambiguity. Taphonomy disturbs contexts, later agriculture and plowing erase details, and coastal dynamics can rework graves into palimpsests. Even our best dates come with error margins, even our chemical signatures can be shifted by salt and time. Recognizing those limits is not defeatism, it is honesty. It allows us to frame competing hypotheses rather than stamp one as definitive. When a trident seems too early or iron signals come from a later smelting tradition, the productive response is not to insist on a single storyline but to design better tests, to return with fresh samples, to open conversations across disciplines, geology, acoustics, ethnography, because the questions are interdisciplinary by nature. The emotional payoff of this work is not merely intellectual. Archaeology is, at its heart, an act of empathy. Recovering a polished flint mirror from a cyst is a way of touching a person who lived out their life centuries ago. Reading the ritual sequence in a necropolis lets us imagine a family watching a procession by torchlight. Uncovering tiny whistles beside infants at a cliff reiterates what mortality does to communities. It provokes improvisation, grief made into practice. In every case, we find people who cared deeply for others, who argued about the right way to be buried, who negotiated new goods and new rights in times of mobility and stress. Their fears and hopes are not alien to ours. They wanted meaning, they wanted continuity, they wanted to leave traces. And there is a civic lesson here too. Many of these sites have survived because of local memory and local stewardship. Farmers who kept odd stones unmolested, fishermen who preserved stories through generations, parish records that noted unusual burials. Heritage is not merely the province of specialists, it is woven into community life. Respecting that relationship is ethically crucial. Scientists enter landscapes that are also living cultural spaces. Collaborative archaeology that pays attention to local lore and local stakeholders produces richer interpretations and sustains preservation. So what do we actually know in the end? We know that Normandy's past is more porous, more connected, and more performative than a tidy textbook might allow. We know that people moved, exchanged goods, and reused monuments as ways to negotiate identity. We know that ritual practices varied but often relied on repeatable patterns, standard object kits, alignments that stitched communities to the sky, and liminal burials that married land and water. We know many technical specifics, dates that cluster in recognizable windows, isotopic signatures that reveal diets and possible mobility, microscopic tool marks that betray production techniques. But we also know the humility of absence, missing workshops for a metallurgical outlier, the uncertain provenance of traded goods, the partial preservation that gives tantalizing hints but not full narratives. That is the real beauty of these problems. They admit of small certainties and large invitations. We can be scientifically rigorous without being spiritually barren. We can test hypotheses without suppressing imagination. Each trench opened and each bead analyzed is both an answer and a question. The archaeologist is part detective, part storyteller, part engineer, and part keeper of silence. Our role is to assemble plausible narratives and to leave open the spaces for revision, for new methods to overturn older assumptions. Now, as our journey ends, return once more to the landscape in which these mysteries sleep. Walk the ridge paths with a renewed sense that every low mound, every solitary stone, every pattern of peat and loam might be a voice. Walk the marshes with the knowledge that tides have rearranged more than silt. They have reshaped human memory. Walk the cliffs with empathy for the rituals that rose from grief. In doing so, you become part of the same human impulse that made these marks in the first place: to notice, to care, to mark, to pass on. The past is not a foreign country we visit in tidy tours. It is a neighbor whose mailbox contains letters written in materials that do not survive easily, stones, bone, shells, and whose handwriting we are learning to decipher. So keep your questions precise and your imagination open. When you hear a local tale of a humming stone or a drowned town, listen. When you see a bead whose chemistry refuses to fit your map, celebrate the surprise. The work of understanding is communal. Scientists, villagers, students, storytellers all have parts to play. And perhaps most important, let wonder temper skepticism. Where skepticism prevents credulity, wonder prevents nihilism. Together they give us a method and a feeling that make this exploration humane. We close with an open invitation not to finality but to continuing curiosity. Keep your boots muddy, your notebooks ready, and your ears open to the stories elders tell at the pub. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.